My name is Ethan, and I've always been drawn to the wilderness. There's something about being surrounded by nature, far from the noise and distractions of city life, that just feels right. This year, I decided to take a solo backpacking trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I'd heard stories about its breathtaking views and challenging trails, but also whispers of something else, something older, something unsettling. I arrived at the park on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. As I started hiking deeper into the woods, the sunlight filtering through the dense canopy created an eerie, dappled light. The trail was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Usually, in popular parks, you'd hear the chatter of other hikers, but here it was just the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I consulted my map, making sure I was on the right path to my first campsite, Deep Creek. According to the park ranger, it was a moderate hike about 5 miles in, easy enough for a day's trek. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease started to creep in. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't quite right. The trees seemed to grow taller and denser, blocking out more and more of the sky. Shadows stretched long and distorted, playing tricks on my eyes. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild, fueled by those spooky stories I'd half dismissed before coming here. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding, and scanned the trees. Nothing. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident even to my own ears. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and cold, like a shroud settling over the forest. I continued on, forcing myself to focus on the trail, on putting one foot in front of the other. But the silence was becoming oppressive, the shadows deeper, and the feeling stronger. It was like the woods themselves were watching me, waiting, and I couldn't shake the growing certainty that I was no longer alone in the Great Smoky Mountains. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the green abyss. The air grew heavy, thick with a dampness that clung to my skin. The silence, which had initially been peaceful, now felt suffocating. It was a silence that pressed in on you, amplifying every small sound, the frantic thump of my own heart, the rasp of my breath, the whisper of wind through the leaves that sounded almost like voices. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the beauty around me. Towering trees draped in moss, vibrant ferns carpeting the forest floor, and the rich, earthy smell of decaying leaves. But even these natural wonders seemed tainted, imbued with a sense of decay and hidden menace. The colors were too intense, the shadows too dark, the silence too profound. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I noticed something odd. Scattered along the path were small piles of stones, stacked in unnatural formations, 3 stones here, 5 stones there, balanced precariously as if by someone's seen hand. They were unlike any trail markers I'd ever seen. A shiver ran down my spine. Was this some kind of local custom, or something else entirely? I kicked at one of the piles, a small stack of flat grey stones. They tumbled apart, scattering onto the trail. Immediately, the temperature seemed to drop. A gust of wind, colder than any autumn breeze, swept through the trees, making them groan and creak like old bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly chilled to the core despite the exertion of hiking. Looking up, I realized the sky had become overcast, the sunlight completely swallowed by a thick layer of clouds. The forest grew darker, the shadows deeper, and the feeling of being watched intensified tenfold. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a palpable presence, like something was closing in, circling me, drawing nearer with every step I took. Then I heard it again, a faint rustling in the undergrowth, closer this time, to my left. I stopped, straining my ears, every muscle tense. The rustling stopped too. Silence descended once more, heavier and more menacing than before. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak and reedy in the vast emptiness of the woods. Only the echo answered, bouncing back from the silent trees, mocking my attempt at bravado. I started walking again, faster now, my pace bordering on a jog. I needed to reach Deep Creek, to find my campsite, to be somewhere that felt safer. But with every step, the woods seemed to push back, the trail growing steeper, the trees closing in, and the unseen presence drawing ever closer. I was no longer just hiking in the Great Smoky Mountains. I was trapped in them. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my composure. The jog turned into a run, fueled by a primal urge to escape the oppressive woods. Branches whipped at my face, thorns snagged at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. The trail, once clearly defined, seemed to dissolve into a confusing maze of roots and fallen leaves. I stumbled, nearly fell, but scrambled back to my feet, driven by the unseen pursuer I could feel closing in. The whispering wind intensified, no longer just rustling leaves, but seeming to form actual words, unintelligible murmurs that slithered into my ears and burrowed into my mind. It sounded like voices, many voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, yet somehow understood on a deeper, more disturbing level. They spoke of shadows, of hunger, of things that should not be awakened. Ahead, through the thinning trees, I glimpsed a flicker of light. Hope surged through me, a desperate, fragile thing. It had to be Deep Creek, the campsite, salvation. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the ache in my muscles, focusing solely on that distant glimmer. As I burst into a small clearing, the light solidified into a flickering campfire. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. I wasn't alone. There were other people here. Safety. But as I got closer, the relief curdled into a fresh wave of unease, colder and more profound than anything I'd felt before. The campfire was small, almost pathetic, casting weak, dancing shadows that did little to penetrate the oppressive darkness of the surrounding woods. And around the fire there was no one. No tents pitched, no backpacks scattered about, no sign of human presence except for the fire itself, burning merrily in the deepening twilight as if tended by invisible hands. The silence here was different too, not just empty, but expectant, as if the woods were holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I approached the fire cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the small knife I carried in my pack. The heat radiating from the flames was strangely weak, barely warming the chill air. Kneeling beside it, I poked at the burning wood with a stick. It was real fire. I could feel the heat, see the embers glow, but something was profoundly wrong. Then I saw it, etched into the ground near the fire pit. Another pile of stones, but this one was different, larger, more deliberately constructed, forming a rough circle around the fire pit itself. And on top of the stones, something else. Something that made my blood run cold. Bones, small bones, bleached white and arranged in a grotesque, unsettling pattern. Animal bones, I told myself, trying to rationalize the horror rising in my throat. Just animal bones. But even as I thought it, I knew, with a chilling certainty that defied logic, that they weren't. The sight of the bones paralyzed me for a moment. My mind struggled to reconcile the ordinary at campfire. A campsite with the utterly bizarre and disturbing, the circle of stones, the bone arrangement. Animal bones, I repeated to myself, a mantra against the rising tide of fear. But the stark white of the bones against the dark earth, the unerring symmetry of their placement, screamed otherwise. Driven by a morbid curiosity that warred with my growing terror, I leaned closer, examining the bone arrangement. They were small, delicate, clearly not from any large animal. Bird bones, rabbit, something smaller, and they were arranged in a spiral pattern, radiating outwards from the center of the fire pit, each bone meticulously placed, as if in some macabre ritual. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I scrambled back from the fire, stumbling away from the clearing, desperate to put distance between myself and that horrifying circle. The wood seemed to press in again, the shadows deepening, the whispering wind intensifying its unintelligible murmurings. As I backed away, my foot bumped against something hard. I glanced down, and my breath hitched in my throat. Another pile of stones, smaller than the circle around the fire, but still deliberately stacked. And on top of this pile, not bones, but something equally unsettling, a piece of cloth. Torn, faded, and stained with dirt, but unmistakably cloth. It looked like a piece of clothing, a child's garment, perhaps. The thought sent a fresh jolt of icy dread through me. This wasn't just strange. It was starting to feel sinister. I forced myself to take a step closer, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the cloth. As my fingers brushed against the rough fabric, a sound pierced the oppressive silence. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. Not a bear, not a wolf, not a coyote. It was deeper, raspier, laced with a chilling undercurrent of something inhuman. The sound vibrated through the air, through the ground, into my very bones, sending shivers of pure terror down my spine. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the snapping of twigs and the rustling of undergrowth, no longer random, but purposeful, deliberate, as if something large and heavy was moving through the woods, directly towards me. Whatever it was no longer content to watch from the shadows. It was coming for me. And the campfire, the clearing, the false promise of safety, suddenly felt like a trap, a stage set for something terrible to unfold. I had to get out of there. Now. Run. That single word screamed in my mind, overriding all reason, all hesitation. I didn't look back, didn't try to identify the source of the growl, didn't even think. I just turned and fled, plunging back into the suffocating darkness of the woods, abandoning the false haven of the campsite. The trail was gone now, or I'd lost it in my panic. I stumbled blindly through the trees, branches clawing at me, the uneven ground treacherous beneath my feet. The growling pursued me, echoing through the trees, always just behind, always drawing closer. It was joined now by other sounds, heavy footfalls, crashing through the undergrowth, the snapping of thick branches, the rustling of leaves like a swarm of unseen things were being dragged through them. I risked a glance over my shoulder, a foolish, desperate act. Through the trees, I glimpsed movement, a dark, indistinct shape, too large to be human, too swift to be any animal I knew. It moved with an unnatural gait, a loping, ground-eating stride that closed the distance between us with terrifying speed. Shadows clung to it, obscuring its form, making it seem less like a creature of flesh and blood, and more like a living embodiment of the darkness itself. My breath hitched in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to put distance between myself and that thing. I veered off the path, scrambling down a steep slope, hoping to lose it in the denser undergrowth. Thorns tore at my skin, rocks bruised my ankles, but I pressed on, adrenaline coursing through my veins, masking the pain, fueling my desperate flight. The whispering wind intensified, swirling around me, no longer just murmuring but howling, the unintelligible voices rising to a feathered pitch. It felt like the woods themselves were alive, sentient, and actively trying to impede my escape, to deliver me into the grasp of the unseen pursuer. Roots snaked out to trip me, branches reached out to snag me, the very air seemed to thicken, slowing me down, trapping me. Ahead I saw a flicker of water, the faint sheen of moonlight reflecting off a surface, a stream, a river. Hope flared again, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. Water. Maybe water could slow it down, confuse its trail, offer a chance of escape. I plunged towards the water, crashing through the undergrowth, ignoring the sounds of pursuit that were still relentlessly closing in. Bursting through the last line of trees, I reached the bank of a creek, its dark surface rippling in the faint moonlight. Without hesitation, I plunged in, the icy water shocking my system, stealing my breath, but offering a desperate, fleeting sense of sanctuary. The icy water of the creek stole my breath and numbed my skin instantly. It was shockingly cold, biting through my clothes, stealing the warmth from my body. But it was also a refuge, a momentary barrier between me and whatever was hunting me in the woods. I waded deeper into the creek, the water rising to my waist, then my chest, the current tugging at my legs, threatening to sweep me off my feet. The growling from the wood's edge paused, replaced by a frustrated snarl that echoed across the water. I dared to look back. The dark shape stood at the tree line, half hidden in shadow, but undeniably there, its massive form outlined against the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds. It didn't enter the water. It just stood there, watching, waiting, its presence radiating a palpable sense of malice and predatory hunger. Taking advantage of the momentary reprieve, I pushed further into the creek, moving downstream, fighting against the current, the sharp rocks underfoot biting into my bare ankles. The whispering wind still swirled around me, but the voices seemed faint to hear, muffled by the rushing water. For the first time since entering these woods, I felt a sliver of hope, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, I could escape. The creek twisted and turned, carving a winding path through the deepening forest. The banks grew steeper, the trees closing in overhead, forming a dark, waterlogged tunnel. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and decaying vegetation, a cloying, almost suffocating odour that mingled with the chill of the water and the growing dread in my heart. As I rounded another bend, I saw something ahead that made me stumble, nearly losing my footing in the rushing current. A waterfall, not a large one, maybe 10 or 15 feet high, but still a significant obstacle, a churning cascade of white water plunging into a dark pool below. My heart sank. My escape route was blocked. I scanned the creek bank, desperate for another way forward. To my right, the bank rose sharply, a sheer cliff face of rock and tangled roots. To my left, the woods were impenetrable, a wall of dense undergrowth and towering trees. I was trapped. The waterfall was ahead, the unseen pursuer was behind, and the icy creek offered no real sanctuary, only a temporary delay. The growling started again, closer this time, no longer frustrated but confident, anticipatory. It knew I was trapped. It knew I had nowhere left to run. The dark shape moved at the edge of the tree line, pacing me along the bank, its unseen eyes burning into me even through the shadows. Desperation clawed at me. I had to do something, anything. Climbing the waterfall was impossible. The banks were impassable, and turning back meant running directly into the jaws of whatever was hunting me. There was only one option left, a desperate, reckless gamble. I had to go under. Into the dark pool beneath the waterfall, hoping to somehow find a way through, or at least to hide, to disappear, to become one with the shadows and the icy water, and pray that whatever hunted me would lose my trail. Taking a deep breath against the frigid air, I plunged beneath the surface of the creek, into the dark, churning depths of the pool beneath the waterfall. The icy water enveloped me, a shock that stole my breath and plunged me into disorienting darkness. The roar of the waterfall was deafening, a constant, vibrating pressure against my eardrums. I opened my eyes but could see nothing in the murky depths, only swirling silt and the faint, diffused light filtering down from the surface. The cold was intense, numbing my limbs, making my muscles ache, stealing my will to move. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was trapped underwater in the dark with no idea where to go, no sense of direction, and the terrifying presence still lurking above. I had to get out, had to breathe, had to escape. But which way was up? Which way was forward? Disorientation clawed at me, threatening to unravel my already frayed nerves. I kicked out blindly, pushing myself deeper into the pool, hoping to find some kind of underwater passage, some way out from under the waterfall. My hands groped through the dark water, encountering only slick rocks and tangled weeds. The pressure in my chest was building, my lungs screaming for air, my vision starting to blur at the edges. Just as my lungs felt like they would burst, my hand brushed against something solid, something different from the smooth rocks and soft weeds. Something rough, textured, almost artificial. Desperate, I followed the texture, my fingers tracing along a cold, unyielding surface. It felt like stone, a wall, an underwater rock face. Hope flickered again, a tiny spark in the suffocating darkness. If it was a wall, there might be a passage, a cave, some kind of opening hidden beneath the waterfall. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, I pushed myself towards the stone, my lungs burning. My head pounding, my vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. Following the wall, I felt a change in the current, a subtle shift in the water's flow. It was pulling me sideways towards the wall, as if guiding me. And then I felt a gap, a narrow opening in the stone, a dark, gaping maw leading into the unknown. With the last vestiges of my strength, I squeezed through the opening, scraping against the rough rock, my lungs screaming for release. On the other side, the water was calmer, the current gentler, the darkness even more profound. But there was air, a pocket of air, trapped in a small, submerged cavern. I broke the surface, gasping for breath, sucking in lungfuls of the cold, damp air, my body trembling uncontrollably from the icy shock and the lingering terror. I was in a small, enclosed space, completely submerged except for this tiny air pocket, surrounded by rock and darkness, still underwater, but alive, for now, above the roar of the waterfall. I could still hear the whispering wind, the unintelligible voices, and fainter now, but still present, the low, guttural growl of the thing that hunted me. It hadn't given up. It was still out there, waiting, and I was trapped in the heart of the mountain, in the cold, dark embrace of the great Smoky Mountains, with no escape in sight. Trapped in the claustrophobic air pocket, I clung to the rough cavern wall, shivering uncontrollably. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, ghostly luminescence of my watch face. 6 to 7 p.m., barely evening, yet it felt like the dead of night, a night that would never end. The roar of the waterfall echoed around me, a constant reminder of the watery prison that surrounded me. Slowly, my breathing evened out, the frantic gasps replaced by shallow, measured breaths. The icy water still gnawed at my body heat, but the initial shock was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold that settled into my marrow. I was alive, yes, but for how long? And what awaited me if I ever managed to escape this submerged tom? The guttural growling from outside seemed to have subsided, replaced by a different sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the rock, resonating in my chest. It was slow, deliberate, heavy, like the footfalls of some immense creature pacing back and forth on the bank above, guarding the waterfall, guarding me. I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts, to formulate a plan. But my mind was a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion, replaying the terrifying chase. The bone circle, the growling shadow. Rational thought felt impossible, logic dissolving in the face of the inexplicable horror I had encountered. opening my eyes again. I let them adjust to the absolute darkness, straining to see if there was anything in the cavern beyond the small air pocket. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the blackness of jagged rock walls, slick with moisture looming in around me, closing in. The cavern was tiny, no more than a few feet in any direction, a dead end, a watery grave. Or was it? As my eyes adjusted further, I noticed something on the far wall, a faint line, a darker shadow within the shadows. It looked like a crack, a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely visible in the gloom, but undeniably there. Could it be another passage, another way out, or just another dead end, another cruel illusion of hope? With a surge of desperate energy, I pushed myself away from the wall, kicking out in the water, propelling myself towards the fissure. The cold water stung my skin, the darkness pressed in around me, the rhythmic thumping from above continued its relentless beat. But I focused on that faint line in the rock, that fragile possibility of escape. Reaching the far wall, I ran my hands along the cold, rough stone, tracing the line of the fissure. It was narrow, barely wider than my hand, but extended upwards, disappearing into the darkness above the waterline. And as I felt along its length, I realized it wasn't just a crack, it was an opening, a narrow, vertical shaft leading upwards into the unknown depths of the mountain. Hope surged through me again, stronger this time, a desperate, exhilarating rush. It was a long shot, a near impossible climb in the dark, in the cold, weakened and terrified as I was. But it was the only chance I had. It was either climb, or stay here and wait for whatever was pacing above to find a way in. And I knew, with chilling certainty, that waiting was not an option. Taking another deep breath, steeling myself against the cold and the fear, I reached up, groping for a handhold in the narrow fissure, and began to climb into the darkness. The climb was agonizing. The fissure was narrow, offering only precarious handholds and footholds in the slick, cold rock. The darkness above was absolute, swallowing my headlamp beam, revealing nothing but more rock, more shadow. I pulled myself upwards inch by agonizing inch, my muscles screaming in protest, my fingers raw and bleeding against the sharp edges of the stone. The icy water dripped from my clothes, chilling me to the bone, making my grip falter. The rhythmic thumping from above was stillable, fainter now, but still there, a constant reminder of the presence waiting for me, pacing, guarding. The whispering wind seemed to follow me into the shaft, the unintelligible voices echoing around me, mocking my desperate struggle. The air in the shaft was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something acrid, something ancient. As I climbed higher, the shaft narrowed further, forcing me to contort my body, to squeeze through impossibly tight spaces. Claustrophobia clawed at me, the feeling of being buried alive, trapped in the bowels of the earth, amplifying the terror that already gripped me. I fought back the rising panic, focusing on each handhold, each foothold, forcing myself upwards, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe just minutes, time losing all meaning in the timeless darkness of the mountain. My strength was fading, my grip weakening, my body trembling with exhaustion and cold. Doubt began to creep in, whispering insidious suggestions in my ear. Give up. It's hopeless, you're trapped, you'll die here. But then, just as my resolve was about to break, I felt a change in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible shift, a breath of something fresher, something less oppressive than the stale, tomb-like air of the shaft. And above, in the impenetrable darkness, I thought I saw a glimmer, a faint pinprick of light, so distant, so fragile, it could have been a hallucination. Hope surged through me again, a desperate, last-ditch surge of adrenaline. Ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the fear, I pushed upwards with renewed determination, driven by that faint glimmer of light, that fragile promise of escape. The shaft widened slightly, the handholds becoming more frequent, the climb less agonizing, and then, suddenly, unbelievably, I was there. The shaft opened into a wider space, a small, rocky alcove, and the faint glimmer of light solidified into something real, a narrow opening in the rock face, leading out into the open air. Fresh, cold night air rushed in, washing over me, invigorating me, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. I scrambled out of the shaft, collapsing onto the rocky floor of the alcove, gasping for breath, blinking against the relative brightness of the night sky. Above, the clouds had parted, revealing a sliver of moon, casting a pale, ethereal light over the landscape. I was out of the water, out of the shaft, out of the darkness. But was I truly out of danger? I was still in the great Smoky Mountains, and I was still being hunted. The alcove offered a temporary respite, but not safety. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever hunted me wouldn't be deterred by a rock wall or a waterfall. It was patient, relentless, and the woods themselves seemed to be in league with it. Escape wouldn't be easy, perhaps impossible, but I had to try. Staying put meant waiting to be found. Using the pale moonlight to orient myself, I scrambled out of the alcove, pulling myself onto a narrow ledge that wound along the cliff face. The drop below was sheer and dizzying, disappearing into the darkness. Above, the cliff face rose in the shadows, disappearing into the dense canopy of trees. The ledge was treacherous, barely wide enough for my feet, and the rock was loose and crumbling. One wrong step and I would plummet into the darkness below. But it was a path, the only path I could see. I edged along the ledge, moving slowly, cautiously, testing each foothold before committing my weight. The wind whipped around me, threatening to tear me from the cliff face, the whispering voices swirling in my ears, urging me to fall, to give up, to surrender to the darkness. I ignored them, focusing on the next step, the next handhold, driven by a desperate will to survive. As I rounded a bend in the ledge, I saw at the campfire clearing, far below, bathed in pale moonlight. It looked deceptively peaceful from this distance, the small circle of stones and the dark woods surrounding it. But I knew the horror that lurked there, the unseen presence that haunted those woods, the thing that was still hunting me. And then I saw movement, not in the clearing below but on the cliff face above. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, a large, indistinct shape moving with unnatural agility along the rocks, descending towards me, cutting off my escape route along the ledge. It had found me. It was coming for me. Here, on this narrow precipice, with nowhere left to run. Despair threatened to engulf me, but then something shifted within me. A cold, hard resolve born of fear and desperation. I was cornered, trapped, hunted. But I was not prey. Not yet. I would not surrender. I would fight. Even against something I didn't understand, something that seemed to be born of the woods themselves. I stopped moving along the ledge, turning to face the approaching shadow. I drew the small knife from my pack, the only weapon I had, a pathetic defense against whatever was coming. But it was something. It was a symbol of defiance, a declaration that I would not go down without a fight. The shadow descended, growing larger, more defined as it drew nearer. It was still indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but I could sense its size, its power, its malevolence. The growling started again, low and guttural, vibrating through the rock, promising pain, promising death. It lunged. A blur of darkness, a rush of cold air. A snapping of jaws that seemed to echo through the mountains. I reacted instinctively, lashing out with the knife, aiming blindly at the shadow, at the sound, at the terror. The knife struck something solid, something yielding, followed by a roar of pain, a sound that was both animalistic and something else, something ancient, something unholy. The shadow recoiled, stumbling back along the cliff face, the growling turning into a wounded snore. I pressed my advantage, scrambling forward, slashing wildly with the knife, fueled by adrenaline and pure, unadulterated fear. I didn't know what I was fighting, didn't know if I could hurt it, didn't even know if I could survive. But I would not go down without a fight. The fight was brief, brutal, chaotic, a whirlwind of shadows and screams, of rock and wind, of desperation and defiance. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The shadow recalled again, further this time, then turned and fled, disappearing back into the darkness of the cliff face, leaving behind only silence and the whispering wind, and me standing alone on the narrow ledge, panting, bleeding, terrified, but alive. I stood there for a long time, clinging to the rock, listening, waiting, expecting it to return. But the growling didn't come back. The rhythmic thumping faded into silence. The woods were still, silent, watching, but the hunt seemed to be over, for now. Slowly, cautiously, I resumed my climb along the ledge, moving towards the distant moonlight, towards the faint promise of dawn, towards whatever uncertain future awaited me beyond the great Smoky Mountains. I had survived. I'd escaped. But I knew, with a chilling certainty that would stay with me forever, that I would never truly leave those woods behind. A part of me would always remain there, trapped in the shadows, haunted by the whispers, hunted by the thing in the dark. And I knew, deep down, that one day it would come for me again. The great Smoky Mountains never truly let go of their own.